13 lines. We're on Daf Ayin Gimel today, 13 lines from the top, which is where we left off yesterday because we started in the middle of the Daf yesterday because we started at the new Mishnah. So we're on Ayin Gimel, 13 lines from the top where it says Tanu Rabbanan. Now, what is being dealt with in these sugyot is the question of what do we define as one household, basically. When we're looking at chatzerot, we're looking at houses within a courtyard. So the question is, but what is defined as a household? So for example, if you have 3 sons and they live in the courtyard and the dad lives in the courtyard, and so the 3 sons, they eat with the dad dinner every night, they and things like that, or they're all really one family, but they have four houses in the courtyard. So do we look at them as 4 houses? Do we look at it as one household split into 4 rooms? How do we conceptualize it? So this is what these sugyot are struggling with to define. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Mi sheyesh lo hamesh nashim. He already has a problem. So somebody who has 5 wives, mikablot pras mibalahen, they receive pras. It means that they receive sustenance. In other words, he provides for all 5 wives. Or you have 5 servants who receive their paycheck from their Rav, from the master. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera matir banashim ve'oser ba'avadim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava matir ba'avadim ve'oser banashim. So there's a question. So again, the question here is: so you have the man, and let's say 1 wife lives with him, and 4 wives live in different houses in the same courtyard. So the question is, since they all receive they're all sustained, they're all provided for by him, so they're all part of his household, or not? And the same with servants. You have let's say you have 5 servants. They live in their own quarters in the same courtyard as the master. Their bills are paid by the master. Their food is provided by the master. They're dependent on the master financially, but they live in different homes within the courtyard. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, the women, the wives, are married to him. So they are really considered part of his household, even though they live in separate homes. But the avadim, the servants, they're just employees of the master. If they live in separate houses, we don't view them as part of the household of the master, even though he's taking care of their needs. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava switches it. He says the avadim, the servants, don't really have an independent status. They are completely subjugated to the husband. The man, the master. So therefore, even though they live in separate houses, they should be considered an extension of the master. Whereas the wife, she has some independence. A wife can have her own property. She can have her own, in many ways, her own rights, her own activities. She has a certain amount of autonomy. So therefore, she should really be considered. The wives can be considered, since they have separate homes, to be separate households. So actually, the Shulchan Aruch ends up ruling leniently in both cases, taking the leniency of both, because both of them we can hear the argument for both. They're not mutually exclusive, really. We can see the argument for both. So
they're both his household.
They're both his household in a way, but Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says if you have 5 slaves, servants, living in 5 houses, they're going to be considered separate households, but the wives are not. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says the servants are considered part of the master's household, but the wives are considered independent. So they switch in terms of what they consider to be more integrally connected to his household. But in the end, we take the leniency of both, and we say whether it's 5 servants living in 5 homes in the courtyard, or it's 5 wives living in 5 homes in the courtyard, since they're all sustained by the same person, they're all considered one household in that courtyard. Amar Rav says, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. What is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is the one who told us that with avadim, the servants are considered to be an extension of the master's household, because it says in the pasuk, Daniel, when it talks about Daniel, bitra malka. Okay, Daniel was in at the gate of the king, meaning no matter what Daniel was doing, since Daniel is a servant of the king. Wherever he is, he's considered an extension of the king's domain. And in the same way, the servants, like Rashi says, B'chol makom shu'u chashiv le'bitra malka. Everywhere he is, he's like in the court of the king. So basically, the servants of a person are considered an extension of his household, even though they live in different quarters. Okay?
You said that Mordechai had the same position?
It was very similar. Although he was a little bit more independent, I think, than Yael. But the idea here is that you have when you have these 5 houses, do they need let's say these are the only this husband and his 5 wives are the only people living in the courtyard. Do they need an Eruvei Chatzerot or not? That would be the question. Okay, that would be the issue. Now, Pshita ben Etzel Aviv Ked Amran. So we already dealt with the issue of sons with a father. That if the sons and their father are the only people living in a courtyard, and the sons are supported by the father, so then they don't need an Eruvei Chatzerot. Isha etzel ba'ala ve'eved etzel rabba pluktat Rabbi Yehuda ben Betira Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So we already saw that when it comes to wives and it comes to servants, this is a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda ben Betira and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. But talmid etzel rabbomai. What about a student by his teacher? So the teacher would support. Let's say the teacher supports the students, or let's say today yeshiva. Right? Let's say yeshiva supports the students, provides a stipend for the students, but they live in different quarters. They live in a different, they live in a dormitory or whatever. Right? Let's say they live in a dormitory, but they all eat together in the same thing. They're all supported by the yeshiva.
When the question is Eruvei Chatzerot, we can assume that it's also Shitufei Mevorot.
They might not have a mavoy. It might be only one chatzer. It doesn't even matter.
No, but I mean, if they have Mevorot, I mean, do they need to like?
That's the next Mishnah. So hold on to that idea. Hold on to that thought. Yeah, you're getting ahead of us. 2 different things. So, because a courtyard doesn't have to have a mavoy. You have to have multiple courtyards opening to an alley for it to be a mavoy. So that's another issue. Yeah. So my Tashma, come and listen. The Rav be Rabbi Chia Amar, Rav of the house of Rabbi Chia, meaning in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia, said. So he said that in anu tzrichin la'arev sharei anu somachin al shulchano shel Rabbi Chia, that they said we are relying on the table of Rabbi Chia. He's the one supporting us. For Rabbi Chia be Rabbi Amar, and when Rabbi Chia was in the yeshiva of Rabbi, he said, even though they were living in different houses, they shared a courtyard, but since they were all eating even if they weren't physically eating with their, Rabbi Chia every night at his house, the fact is they were all supported by him, so they're all considered extensions of one household. And therefore they don't need an eruv, provided that they're the only people there. Obviously, if there are other people in the courtyard who are not dependent on Rabbi Chia, now it's a different story. Now they have to deal with the other people living in the courtyard. But if they're the only people in the courtyard, they wouldn't need an eruv. So Abaye asked Rabbah the following question: Chamisha shegavu et eruvan. If you have 5 people living in a courtyard who collected their eruv, so Rashi points out that this exact issue was already dealt with on yesterday's daf. It was dealt with in yesterday's daf. If you have 5 people living in a courtyard and you collect from each one some bread, okay, does each to make an eruv in that chatzer? But now you want to join with another chatzer. So in our chatzer, we have a neighboring chatzer that we have a door between us. We want to connect with the other chatzer. So does each individual have to send something to the other chatzer, or one? Now we already talked about this on yesterday's daf and said that just one needs to. But Rashi says either Abaye didn't know about that baraita, or he was asking whether that was the definitive ruling or not. So Amarle Eruv Echad Lechudan, Rabbah said 1 eruv is enough for everybody. You only need 1 eruv. Once you're dispatching to another chatzer, you're dispatching to another courtyard to join with them, so you only need 1. But what about brothers? Brothers, we consider brothers like people who already have an eruv together. Because we said that since the brothers all rely on their father for food, for support, so they're living in the courtyard, so they're like people who have an eruv, effectively. They don't need an eruv because it's like they have one. And we said that if there are other people involved, in other words, if there are other people living in the courtyard besides the sons and the father, now they need an eruv from each member, from each son. So why is it different? In other words, just like over there, if they're by themselves, they're already set. It's like they have an Eruv already. But if they're joining with other people, each one needs to participate. So to here, amongst ourselves, we already collected an Eruv. We're good. But now that we want to join with the other group, we should also need, each one of us should have to send something. It's not enough that only one person represent the entire courtyard. Just like the brothers who are considered, let's say there are two brothers and a father, they're considered one entity when they're by themselves. If there's somebody else in the picture, now each one is considered separately. So it should be the same.
Didn't we say that they don't have to, that they do have to join in the Eruv with other people in their courtyard, so as not to undercut the notion of Eruv?
Yeah, that's why. But each one has to send something.
Because of that reason.
Right, so it should be the same here. I mean, if we combine our courtyard into one, so we're no different than the father and the sons who are combined as one. So everybody from each one has to join. Well, it will end up being that only one has to send to the other, because then they keep it over there, and maybe that one is, since they're holding the Eruv, it's different. Yeah, it's different. Yeah. So, because it's a uniting thing, so they have to be united. So, okay, so why is there a distinction? Why are you telling me that when one courtyard wants to join with another courtyard, that each person doesn't have to send? Only one Eruv has to be sent on behalf of everybody. But when it comes to the sons with the father, if they have to make an Eruv with other people, each son has to send his own. So what's the difference? In other words, that's a different story, because when the father with the sons, in that case there are other people living in their courtyard. So just like once those other people live in the courtyard, create division, so we apply it across the board. We say, you know what? We're all separate now. The presence of those other people makes us all separate. Okay, so however, here we've united ourselves already, and we're sending something over to another courtyard. That's a different story. Within the courtyard, we can't say the father and the two sons are united as one unit, and you have two other people. I mean, you look at it, all or nothing. It's all or nothing within the courtyard. So when it's just the father and the two sons, fine. But when you have another person in the picture, so now we have to say everybody's independent. But once we've united in an Eruv and we're all one, so now to join with another courtyard, we only need to send one present over there. Okay? Hachinami mistabra, it makes sense that way, because it says in the Mishnah, Eimatay bezman shmolichen et Eruvan b'makom acher, aval im haya Eruvan ba'etzlam, o she'en tirehen imahen b'chatzer, en tzrechin la'aref. And it fits perfectly with the Mishnah. Because what does it say in the Mishnah? That when does each person have to send something of themselves? That's only when they're sending their Eruv to somebody else. But when the Eruv is staying with the father or one of the two sons, or when there's nobody else in the courtyard, so then they're considered one entity. When they're dispatching out or they're interacting with someone else, there's someone else living in their courtyard. So then they're viewed each one as an individual. Okay, so that's exactly the distinction. So they're only by default, in other words, isolated from everyone else. They're looked at as one entity. But once you bring in other factors, either there are other people living in the courtyard, or they want to connect with another courtyard. So then everything changes, and now they have to make an Eruv amongst it. They have to join in the Eruv, each one as an individual. It's only when they're all by themselves and they're not interacting with anybody else that we view them all as one.
So does that mean then that when we send, and we've already had an Eruv on our side,
when we've already created an Eruv, now we're all one, no matter what.
We only have to send.
Now we only have to send one.
But
the son and the sons and the father, they are only considered one entity when there's nobody else around. But once there's an obligation of Eruv involved, so now they're not considered one anymore. Okay, so Ba'aminei Rav Chia bar Ravin me Rav Sheshet. So Rav Chia bar Ravin asked Rav Sheshet the following question: Bnei berav dachlei nama bebaga vatu baitei beberav ki mashchinan lahu techuma mi berav mashchinan lahu o mi baga mashchinan lahu. So they asked the following question: you have members of the yeshiva who eat out in the field. Okay, they eat out in the valley. Okay, so they would eat their dinner in the valley, and then they would come and sleep in the yeshiva. So they would come into the city and sleep in the yeshiva, but there wasn't enough space for them, let's say, to eat there. So they would eat out in the valley. And they had a place set up for them to eat. So the question is, where do we measure their eruv from? We know they get 2,000 amot in every direction, so we have a problem because they're eating in the valley. But they're sleeping inside, and we discussed before this issue about eating and sleeping. What's the definitive factor? So the Gemara says, Amar Lei said to him, Mashchinan mi berav. We go by where they sleep. Okay, and they sleep in the dormitory, in the house of the yeshiva. So the question is, V'harei notenet eruva b'toch alpayim ama v'atei ubayit b'avetei d'moshchinan le'tchuma me'eruvei. But wait a second, this contradicts the whole idea of eruvei techumin. Because again, we're talking about eruvei techumin here, not eruvei chatzerot, right? So eruvei techumin,
it's your eating place.
You normally leave food out and you sleep inside. Now, if we went by the place where you slept, there would be no eruvei techumin, unless you're camping out where you leave the eruvei techumin, and you don't. So why should it be that here we're following where they sleep and not where they eat? So it says Bahu anan sadeh, because here we see O bahada anan sadeh. And here, there we see, and here we see. What does that mean? That Bahahu anan sadeh de'imit darle hatam nichale. O bahada anan sadeh de'imaitule urifta leberav nichale utfei. Because it all goes by where you'd rather have it. So before, when we were talking about Eruvei, when we're talking about Eruv, and we're talking about what's the definitive location of the Eruv? Are we measuring it by where you sleep or where you eat, like we learned in yesterday's daf? So in that case, why is it that the shepherds or the agricultural workers who are out in the field, we measure it by where they're sleeping, which is out in the field? And here you're telling me, I'm sorry, we measure it there. What are we talking about? No, I'm sorry, we're not talking about that case now. We're talking about in a normal case of Eruvei Techumin, right? In a normal case of Eruvei Techumin, where you put your food out in the forest, because that's where you want to measure your Eruv from. So over there we say that we measure the 2,000 amot from where you put your Eruv. And here we're saying we're measuring the 2,000 amot from where you're sleeping. So he says, what's the reason? What's the difference? Because it goes by where you want to be. He says, since you're going, if you had a place, in other words, to sleep where you left your Eruv, you would do it. It's just that it's out in the forest, so you're not going to. And here, if you had a place to eat in the yeshiva, you would. Right? In other words, in both cases, you're making a compromise. So when it comes to the normal case of Eruvei Techumin, you're leaving your bread in the forest. If you had a nice hotel in the forest that you could make that your lodging, you would do it.
You'd sleep there.
Yeah, but you don't have, so you come home. You're forced to come home. But really, you want to make that your makom shevita. So, because it'll cut down on your travel time if you could actually sleep there. It would be easier for you. Because obviously the reason you're putting your Eruvei Techumin there is because you want to travel from there. Whereas here, the Bnei Yeshiva really would prefer to be able to eat in the yeshiva where they're going to sleep. The only problem is there's no space or whatever. It's not logistically feasible. So therefore they have to eat in the valley. But where do they really want to make their place of Shevita? In the yeshiva. So that's why we measure it from the yeshiva. So don't look at the externals of where they actually eat or where they actually sleep. Look at where they'd actually like it to be.
So what's the criteria, sleeping or eating? Because it could go either way.
It's not absolute.
It could go either way, and it doesn't matter. It's really sort of both.
Right, it's really both.
And if there's a separation, it's because it's against your will, and you'd really rather have them together.
Right, it seems like, exactly.
Oh.
It seems more like it goes by the eating, by the food. But the only thing is, so when there's a separation between the two, so then we have to ask which is the dominant one. Mm-hmm. And if it's that, well, I'm sleeping in this place, and really I want this to be my place, but the only problem is I can't eat here.
Then that would be it.
So then we're going to go by the place where you're sleeping. If you're eating in a place and you say, you know what, I really wish I could sleep here, but I can't, so then you're clearly saying that's where you want to be.
But it's not. There is a place of sleeping and a place of eating, and it doesn't matter as long as you have both. It wouldn't be that as long as you have a place.
You have to choose one. You have to choose one.
You choose one.
Yeah. So okay. So Ba'era mi Rav Chisda, Rabbi Bar Chama asked Rav Chisda, Av uvno Rav v'talmido karabim damu or kayichidim damu. Tzrichin eruv v'ein tzrichin eruv. Mavoy shelahen nitar balechi v'korah or en nitar balecha v'korah. So he asked him a few questions. He says, let's say you have a father and a son, they live in a courtyard. They each own a house in the courtyard, but in other words, they're all under one auspices. The father supports the son, they live in the courtyard. Or a Rav and a Talmid, right? So the teacher and the student. How do we treat them? So Rashi says, what is this talking about? What is the case talking about here? So he says, Remember, we talked about a case where there's an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. And the person who lives in the inner courtyard has to pass through the outer courtyard in order to get through. So it says, Ima yushal yachidim shayachid darba penimit davya regela muteret bimkoma ina oseret shelo bimkoma vim shel rabim v'lo erava penimit latzma davya regela osra bimkoma oseret ala chitona filo erava chitona latzma. So he says that the question is, since you have a multiplicity in the inner courtyard, it's going to prohibit the outer courtyard as well. Okay, the father and the son are living in the inner courtyard. They're going to prohibit that courtyard that they have to pass through. So do we look at them as two dwellings, or do we look at them as one dwelling?
Is the father supporting the son, or is it? Or
so he doesn't mention it here. I would have assumed yes. It's a little bit unclear because actually Rashi's
otherwise it would be obvious.
Because Rashi, right? You
then
would
it
think
would be two.
right because if they're actually dependent on one another, in other words, one would think the son is dependent on the father.
So if he is, and it's only the two of them,
right?
it's one.
That's the whole problem, right? So all the Mefarshim, right? So all the Mefarshim have a problem with Rashi. Because they say, according to this, it's the same case we had before. And we already said that if the son is dependent on the father, they're considered like one person. If the son is not dependent on the father, the implication is that they're considered like two people. So what's the question here? If what they're considered as one or as two? The Mefarshim suggest some other interpretations. This is what Rashi says, but the Tosafot talks about this problem.
It could be that the question is that is that union necessary only when they live by themselves or with other people?
No.
Right?
They're by themselves.
No, they're definitely by themselves, because if there are other people, then for sure it
otherwise
doesn't
it won't work. If there's other people, we learned that it won't work.
In other words, the union...
You can't have those two as one and then a couple of other people.
Right, that only happens when they're by themselves. Okay.
Yeah.
So what Tosafot wants to say is that we're not talking about the case that Rashi says. We're not talking about that case. What we're talking about is where the father and son are the only people in this courtyard. Okay? And the father and son have a mavoy in front of their courtyard. They have an alleyway in front of their courtyard. And so, according to Rabbeinu Yitzchak and the Tosafot, he says, that they have, let's say, for instance, a father and a son. So you have a father and a son is in one chatzer, and a Rav and a Talmid is in another chatzer, another courtyard. So either of these, they don't require anything, right?
Right.
And in the other side, that doesn't require anything either.
The separate
right?
Mavoy.
So he says, so either you have only a father and a son in the whole thing, or a Rav v'Talmido, Mishtakachat Torat Eruv. So he says the problem is that, let's say for example you have two chatzerot, you have two courtyards. One courtyard has the dad, one courtyard has the son. Or one courtyard has the Rav, one courtyard has the Talmid. So the problem is there's going to be no Eruvin and no Shituf Mavo'ot in here at all. You're going to have two chatzerot that have nothing, right, and you're going to have a Mavoy that has nothing.
So
because
the Rav and the father,
because they look like two separate courtyards, but really they're not. Halachically, they're not. That's how Tosafot understands the case. Rashi understands the case that we're dealing with is an inner courtyard with a Rav and a Talmid, now, or with an Av and a Ben. Now, it could be like you could defend Rashi because everyone asks the question, well, what's the issue? What's the issue according to Rashi? It shouldn't be an issue because we already said that the father and the son are one. So if they're in the inner courtyard and they pass through the outer courtyard, what's the problem? It's like having one person. Right? But so I was thinking, you could say though, the question is, according to Rashi, that we do say that even when you have the father and the son, right? Still, it's considered a problem if there's another person with them.
And they're going to pass through another.
Right? And they're going to pass through the guy in front of them.
Maybe.
Right? Because remember, it's an inner courtyard, and in order to get out, they have to pass through the outer courtyard. Remember?
Right.
So it could be that the Rashi is obviously didn't forget what we just learned 5 minutes ago. So it could be that what Rashi is bothered with, what he thinks the Gemara is asking here is that since there's somebody in the outer courtyard and this inner courtyard's open to the outer courtyard, even though in the inner courtyard it's just a father and son, maybe because there's somebody in the outer courtyard that creates a problem. Because they're not really totally independent. You see, it just occurred to me that could be the
cool.
Right. That could be the solution. Right. True.
Here's the other thing I was thinking about. You have father and son, rabbi and son, right? But here you have father and son, rabbi and son.
Right.
In other words, can the rabbi and the father, do the
they could, but because they're not related.
We're not involving the kids,
because
but the kids are involved just by the fact that they're
right. But it's two different cases. It's two different cases. In other words, it's two different cases.
So that would
right.
be a different case. So
now, I mean, I guess you could construct a case where you had, let's say, the father and son in one courtyard and the Rav and Talmid in the other courtyard, but then you still have just one household in each courtyard, and you need at least 2 batim opening and 2 chatzerot. Right. So okay. So, but I'm suggesting maybe that's what Rashi's issue is. That do we consider this as involving the person in the outer courtyard or not? Yeah. And therefore we say, well, now the father and son who are in the inner courtyard are really in a bind. Okay, even though the guy in the outer courtyard doesn't usually impinge upon them, but since they're going to pass through, maybe that separates them. Right. Okay, because he's involved, or maybe not. That's what I was thinking might be the possibility. So, in any case, though, so he says, here are the 3 questions. First of all, are they like Yechidim or are they like Rabim? Are they considered like 1 or 2? Because if they're considered like 1, okay, so then they certainly would not affect the person on the outside either. In the outside courtyard either, according to Rashi. If they're like 1, though, then obviously they don't need an eruv amongst themselves. But the other thing is that if it's 1, then the mavoi that they open to, let's say it opens to a mavoi. The mavoi that they're open to, can it be permitted with a lechi or a korah? Because normally for a lechi or a korah to be able to be permitted to permit a mavoi. Remember, a mavoi is an alleyway that's closed on 3 sides. It's open on 1 side, and there's either a lechi, which is the vertical piece, or the horizontal piece going across the front of the mavoi. That only works when you have 2 courtyards opening to the mavoi, each of which has 2 batim.
Looks like Tosfot has a long discussion.
Yeah. So what are you going to do here? What are you going to do if you have, in our cases, Rashi says, "Dekaimalan en mavoi nitar b'lechevekor ad sheyu batim v'chatzirot betuchim betucho v'im timtze lo mahar neki chidim damu hacham michashvinan shetei chatzirot achad shel av v'achad shel ben kechad chatzer v'lo mishum mavoi ditu." In other words, in this case, we're saying the father lives in one courtyard and the son lives in another courtyard. They're the only 2 courtyards that open to this mavoi. So do we look at it as 1 courtyard or 2? If it's only 1 courtyard, then you're going to have the problem that a mavoi that's only 1 courtyard opens to, a lechi doesn't work. Only when you have 2 courtyards does a lechi work. And you're telling me that the father and son are 1. So we answer him.
The Gemara does not bring anywhere the language of lechi or korah.
It does, right here.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, right.
Yeah, so what does he say? So Amar le Tinito, what we learned that already. So he says the father and son or the student and teacher, when they don't have anyone else living with them in their courtyard, they're like 1. They don't require an eruv, and according to Rashi, that means they wouldn't prohibit the person in the outer courtyard because they're considered 1 person only. And their mavoi is permitted with a lechi and a korah, which means that in one respect we're lenient. that if they're in one courtyard, in other words, if the father and son are in one courtyard, we consider them to be one entity. So they don't require an eruv. And even if their courtyard opens to another courtyard, we don't say that the fact that they pass through that outer courtyard is a problem. However, if they're living in two courtyards, the father lives in one, and the son lives in the other one, and they open to a common mavoi, we don't say that they're considered to be one, since they live in separate courtyards, and therefore the mavoi is considered a mavoi that serves two courtyards. I mean, that serves two courtyards,
so
and therefore the lechem works. Right. Insofar as
they're lenient in every case.
Right, they're being lenient.
Right.
So, but in that first case that the leniency that you just described, that's two courtyards, inner and outer, and that's all that opens to the mavoi. And
there are two cases here. One case is where, according to Rashi, the one case is where the inner courtyard has the father and son, and the outer courtyard has one other guy.
Right. In that case, where they're lenient and they say they don't have to do an error because the candidate is one. Right. Are those the only two? Is there anything else opening into that mavoi, or are they the only ones opening to the mavoi?
That's a different case.
Oh.
The mavoi case is different, where you just have the father and son opening directly.
Just a courtyard.
Let's say on one side of the mavoi is the father's courtyard, on one side of the mavoi is the son's courtyard. They both open to the mavoi.
But if you have an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard,
we don't know about the mavoi in that case. The mavoi doesn't come into that case.
Okay.
Right? That courtyard might open to the public domain. So now the new Mishnah. So you have 5 courtyards, and there's a little drawing in the Rashi here. You have 5 courtyards that are open to one another, so they have doors in between them, and they're open and they're open to the mavoi as well. If they made an eruv between the chatzerot. Okay, so these 5 courtyards make an eruv with one another, but they didn't join the mavoi, because remember, there's 2 things. There's joining courtyards, and there's joining mavoi. Now, normally, joining courtyard is within a courtyard, and joining mavoi is across courtyards, because multiple courtyards share the mavoi. But here, what did you do? You joined one courtyard to another. All 5 courtyards combined to become one courtyard. So he says in that case, "Velo nishtatu b'mavoi mutarin b'chatzerot." Okay, so eruv b'chatzerot velo nishtatu b'mavoi mutarin b'chatzerot v'asurin b'mavoi. They are okay to carry from courtyard to courtyard, but they can't carry in the mavoi
because there's only one opening into the mavoi.
Each courtyard opens to the mavoi, but all the courtyards combined into one. But they didn't combine. They didn't do anything for the mavoi. They only combined their courtyards. So now you can carry from courtyard A to B to C to D to E, but you can't carry from any courtyard into the mavoi because they didn't do a shituf mavoot. They didn't make an agreement. They didn't do an activity to show that they're combining their use of the mavoi into one. They only combined the courtyards into one. We turn to Amud Bet, and Ve'im nishtatfu b'mavoi, if they made a shitufei mavoot, they combined their use of the mavoi, mutarin kan v'chan. Okay, but they didn't. In other words, then they're allowed to, well, the Gemara is going to explain this, but then they're allowed to use both the chatzerot and the mavoi. Okay, if they combine together for the mavoi as well. Eruvu b'chatzerot v'nishtatafu b'mavoi. Let's say they made an eruv chatzerot and they combined with the mavoi as well. V'shachach echad mibnei chatzer v'lo erev. But one member of one of the courtyards forgot to participate in the eruv chatzerot. So what's going to happen now? Mutarin kan v'chan. They're okay in both places. Why? Because since they did a shitufei mavoot, that covers also for the eruv chatzerot. Okay? מבני מבוי ולא נשתתף מותרין בחצרות ואסורין במבוי שהמבוי לחצרות כחצר לבתים. He says, however, if somebody forgot to participate in the mavoi combination, remember there are 2 things here. They would take bread and put it in one of the houses. In other words, in order to combine the chatzerot, they did eruvei chatzerot, to combine all the courtyards together, and then they had to do something to show that they're combining their use of the mavoi. If they combine their use of the mavoi, that covers for everybody. Okay? Even if somebody in one of the courtyards forgot to participate in the eruvei chatzerot.
So he doesn't have to correct the mistake. He doesn't have to.
However,
rights and go.
We'll see. But if if somebody forgot to participate in the shitufei mavo'ot, so that what happens is he's allowed to carry in the chatzerot because he didn't forget to participate in the chatzerot, but he forgot the mavo'ot. So that means they can't use the mavoi. Shamavoi lachatzerot, because the mavoi with respect to the chatzerot is like chatzer labatim. It's like the relationship that the courtyard has to the houses, and we know that if one of the houses forgets to participate in the eruvei chatzerot, nobody can carry. So if one of the people forgets to participate in the thing for the alley, the thing for the mavoi, then nobody gets to carry. But if they did the mavoi thing properly, that apparently will allow people to carry in the chatzerot, even if somebody forgot the chatzerot part.
I guess because they can use this.
Well, because the mavo'ot is more all-encompassing.
They're all-encompassing. In other words, this is clearly everybody, but this, if this guy forgets, or if this guy forgets, then he cannot go in here if this does not, make everything common.
Right. Apparently, the shitufei mavo'ot is considered more. It's more general. It's more general.
More general.
Yeah.
Than the chatzer, because chatzer, there is one chatzer here, but then there is another.
Right, and even though they're joining one to the other. In other words, they're making an eruvei chatzerot in each individual chatzer and connecting to the other ones. It's more particular because each individual is connecting to the next individual, whereas the mavo'ot is more communal because it's something that all 5 chatzerot share. So now the Gemara says, Mani, who is the author here? So now we get into trouble. So Rabbi Meir here, must be Rabbi Meir, the Amar ba'inan eruv uba'inan shituf, because the Mishnah is predicated on the assumption that in the ideal situation, you would make eruvei chatzerot, each chatzer would make an eruv, and would join with the other chatzerot. And you still need to combine for your use of the mavoi. It's 2 separate things. But what about the middle case? Because it said that if they made a shituf for the mavoi, that they're good in both the chatzerot and the mavoi, even though the eruvei chatzerot wasn't done. In other words, as long as they did the shitufei mavo'ot, they're okay. As long as everybody who participated in that, they're okay. Atan the Rabbanan, this is like the rabbis, because the rabbi said all you need is one. All you need is one according to the rabbis. In other words, the rabbis would say that all you need is shitufei mavo'ot, and then you're good.
And you don't have to make an error for any of the courtyards.
Right, you wouldn't have to make an error for the courtyards.
One guy forgot.
Because the mavo'ot is all encompassing.
Whoa.
According to them. So, ha lo kashe, no problem. Ivim nishtatfu nami ka'amar. Okay, so what it means is ve'im nishtatfu nami. In other words, if they also made a shitufei mavo'ot, we're still talking about Rabbi Meir. We're still talking about Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir is saying you need both. So he said, if you made also a shitufei mavo'ot, then they can also carry in the mavoi. He's not saying you can only make a shitufei mavo'ot and now everything is hunky-dory. He's saying both. You need both. But wait a second, but what about the end? If you made an eruvei chatzerot and the mavoi as well, it says that if one of the members of one of the chatzerot forgot to participate in the eruvei chatzerot, he's okay. Why? Because you have shitufei mavo'ot. But wait a second. If he didn't give up his rights in the chatzer, so then amay mutarim. Why are they permitted? Didn't you just tell me that Rabbi Meir requires both? He requires both. But they didn't make an eruvei chatzerot according to that because one of the people forgot. So you're going to tell me that obviously what happened was, in the 5 chatzerot, in the making of the eruvei chatzerot, somebody forgot, and what did the one person who forgot do? He gave up his rights. It has to be. Because you're telling me that they made a shitufei mavo'ot. So everybody can carry in the mavoi. This one guy, though, forgot to join with the eruvei chatzerot, joining the courtyards. So what does that mean? That means it's no good unless he gives up his right in the courtyards. But if that's the case, what about the it says if one of the members of the mavoi forgot and he didn't participate for the mavoi, for the alley, mutarin b'chatzerot v'asurin b'mavoi. So that means that you're okay in the chatzerot, but you're not okay in the mavoi. If we're talking about situations where people give up their rights, amay asurin b'mavoi. So why can't this guy give up his right to the mavoi? And if you're going to tell me that whole idea of giving up your rights only works in the chatzer, it doesn't work in the mavoi. But we learned in a that we have an explicit statement in the Braita where Rabbi Meir says that this person gave up his rights in the mavoi. So clearly one is allowed to give up their rights in a mavoi. And so if we're talking about a case where people are giving up rights, no problem. And if we're talking about a case where people are not able to give up rights, then there is a problem. So what we have here is a disparity, because on one hand it sounds like, if we're going to make everything else equal, certain cases here, like where the person who's part of the Eruvei Chatzerot forgets, what ends up happening is, you have the Shitufei Mavo'ot, and we're okay. But when somebody forgets for the Shitufei Mavo'ot, nobody's allowed to carry in the Mavoy. So why is that?
He announces his rights.
Right. No, he doesn't apparently. He doesn't apparently. So according to Rabbi Meir, if you need both, so then in both cases it should be a problem, because in both cases somebody forgot.
Right.
And if you need only one, so then according to the rabbis, all the cases should be fine. So elap shita de lo batel. So we're talking about a case where the person did not relinquish their rights. Umi de seifad de lo batel, reishanam de lo batel. We must be consistent and say we're not talking about relinquishing here. Reishav seifad Rabbi Meir, metziata Rabbanan. So we must therefore say that the first and last cases are Rabbi Meir, because in the first and last cases of the Mishnah we're talking about where somebody forgot, and therefore we have a problem because you need both. In other words, we're talking about in the first case where you have both, and in the last case where somebody forgot. And it ruins everything because he forgot to join with the mavoy. So he ruins it for everybody because you need both. The middle case that said that if somebody forgot the eruvei chatzerot, but they have shitufei mavoot, that everything is fine. That must be the rabbi's opinion, because they say that you only need one of the two. So then you end up having a strange mixture of, in the Mishnah, of different opinions. Very unusual. So now the Gemara says, no, kula Rabbi Meir hi. The entire thing is Rabbi Meir. V'ta'ama mai. Amar Rabbi Meir ba'inan eruv ba'inan shituf. Remember, what's the reason why Rabbi Meir says you need both? Really, shitufei mava'ot should be enough. Because shitufei mava'ot joins all of the chatzerot together.
Even by Rabbi Meir.
It doesn't just join individual chatzerot, it joins everybody. So what's the problem? Shelo lishakeach Torat Eruv min hatinokot vehacha kevan deruba eruvu lo mishtakach. So he says mishtakcha. So here it's not going to happen. In other words, the Rabbi Meir is saying that normally, why do I require both? Because I don't want you to forget Eruvei Chatzerot. In other words, what will happen is if we only have Shitufei Mavo'ot, people are going to forget the idea that each courtyard really has to be joined in and of itself and with other courtyards. Because we're all just going to join through the alley, join in our use of the alley, and that will cover everything. He says, I don't want that, because then people are going to forget about Eruvei Chatzerot when you don't have an alley. Okay? But he says, but here, almost everybody did Eruvei Chatzerot except for this one guy. So I'll let you rely on the Shitufei Mava'ot in this exceptional case.
Right. To prevent
so Lo Mishtakcha, here we're not going to forget, because everybody obviously did the right thing except this one guy. So since you have the Shitufei Mava'ot, I'm going to let you rely on it. But normally you have to have both, because I don't want you to forget the need for joining the courtyard.
The logic follows, one of the previous logic that we had for, I forget where there is an R, because if you have the Mavoy, and you can walk out of here and walk in here. You can also walk in here and walk in here. So if you can walk in here through this chatzer, then you can also walk through this chatzer.
Right. It makings sense. It includes everything. It includes everything. Right.
And how does halacha work?
What's the bottom line halacha?
Yeah.
That's a good question, actually. I think that you need actually both lechatchila, but I think b'diavad it covered. I think Rabbi Meir is the halacha. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. I have to double check. So now we move on to the next piece. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says, Rav lo tanei petuchot zo lazo. V'chein amar Rav Kana, Rav lo tanei petuchot zo lazo. Rav had a different version of our Mishnah. In his, it didn't say that the courtyards were open to one another. It just said you had 5 courtyards not open to one another that all face the mavoy and are open to the mavoy, and the question is, within themselves, did they make an eruv? Not whether they made an eruv with all the other ones. Okay, so Rashi says.
Can I just ask a question?
Well, let me just wonder what Rashi says. V'chol eruvu b'chatzerot matnitin eruvu kol chatzer la'atzma ka'amar. Okay, so we're going to see what his problem is in a second. Yes. Well,
when they say he had a different version of the Mishnah, does that mean that when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi took he took notes from Rabbi Meir, and then there was another note from Rabbi Yehuda who attended the same class, and they were different, or they just received a different tradition.
Well, it's not clear how the variations emerged. We'd have to speculate. It would be speculative to say how they emerged. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Rav had a different one, and it has a logic behind it. It has a logic behind it. So some say that Rav Kahana himself didn't have the text of Petuchot Zolazo, that these courtyards are open to one another. Actually, they're totally sealed off from one another. They just all open to a common mavoy. So then, Amar le Abai le Rav Yosef, Abai said to Rav Yosef, Ma'ita amat lotani Petuchot Zolazo. What's the reason? Kasavar kol shituf shen machniso motzio derech petachim b'mavoy la shemei shituf. He's going to suggest that the reason is because in order to make a shituf mavoot, in order to make a combination, in order to partner in the use of the alley, the way that you have to do it is that the item that you use, let's say you use food, has to travel using the alley in each courtyard first. So let's say there are 5. So you take it into the courtyard. You take it into the alley, you go into courtyard number 1 and out. Into courtyard number 2 and out. Into courtyard number 3 and out. Now, if there's an opening between the courtyards, so then what can you do that will make it really easy? You don't have to carry it into the alleyway and back into the courtyard, into the alleyway and back into the courtyard, into the alleyway and back into the courtyard. Because you'll just go through those doors that go from courtyard to courtyard. You'll never go into the alleyway. So Rashi says that what's the issue? That it doesn't look like a shituf. Because it doesn't look like you're partnering in the mavoy. Because what connection? Because what are you going to do with the food for the shituf mavoot? You're going to put it in one of the chatzerot, in one of the courtyards. How is it clear that it's a partnership in the alleyway then? In what way does it connect to the alleyway? You don't leave it in the alleyway. So how does it work? So you have to carry it through the alleyway and into each one of the courtyards. And Rav is concerned that maybe you're going to go through the doors in between them. So he says actually this will not work. In a case where in other words, in a case where the doors are open between the courtyards, it's going to be more problematic because you're going to have a concern that the people are going to carry it through the doors. So the Gemara says, wait a second, is that really true that you have to carry the shitufei mavoot in and out of the alley again and again? Is that really correct? There is an objection. If you have a balabayit who had a partnership with one person in wine and with another person in wine, that again, you have people in different chatzerot, in different courtyards, but they share a proprietary interest or an ownership in some wine that's in one of the chatzerot. So that wine can serve as the basis of their shitufei mavoot. They can say, through this wine that we own, we share ownership in this wine. Through our shared ownership, we're also sharing our use of the mavoy. But what? Did they carry the wine in and out of the alleyway? No, it's just sitting there. So what does the Gemara say? Wait, still, hatam de'apke ba'ile. We could still give a difficult answer, but we could still say that they actually took the wine and carried it through the alleyway to demonstrate that they were using it for that purpose. But still, we have another objection to be raised here, that ketzad mishtatfin b'mavoy. It says, how do you combine with a mavoy? Hatam nami da'afke ba'ile. So similarly, in every case where we talk about shitufei mavoot, we're talking about where they actually took the food, carried it through the alley, and carried it through the chatzerot. Matkif la Rabba bar Hanan. So Rabba bar, what should it really say? Bar Rav Hanan. So Rabba bar Rav Hanan said, he raised an objection. Elameata bar about the following case. Iknalo pat besalo. Hachina mid la have shituf. If you have bread in your basket and you transfer ownership of it to everybody in all of the chatzerot, does that not work? It does work. Without moving it.
Like that's what we do in a house.
Right. So, and if you're going to tell me that that's the case, but it says that if you have a group of people who are sitting and Shabbat started, Friday night, the sun starts to go down, they're all sitting around eating. That the bread that's on the table, that they were sitting and eating. let's say members of one courtyard were sitting and eating on Friday, and they have bread on the table. That bread can become their Eruvei Chatzerot. Let's say members of different courtyards were eating at a table, and that bread that's on the table can become the basis of their Shitufei Mavo'ot that allows them to use the alleyway. Wait, but let's finish you have to finish. Amar Rabban, Rabba says, Lo pligei kan bebesubin b'bayit, kan bebesubin b'chatzer. In other words, and what's the only difference between the cases? If they were sitting and eating in one of the houses in the courtyard, so then the bread that's on the table can become their Eruvei Chatzerot. In other words, they forgot to make an Eruvei Chatzerot before, but everybody from the neighborhood they were all eating at your house on Friday. So therefore they could say this bread that's on the table is going to be our Eruvei Chatzerot because it's getting too late for us to make an Eruvei Chatzerot. Or if they were eating out in the courtyard, and people from the other courtyards are coming over, they can say this bread that's on the table is going to be our Shitufei Mavo'ot because it's getting too late to make another one. Okay? So what do you see? Did they carry it in and out of every courtyard and through the Mavoy? No. They didn't carry it into the alleyway and into each courtyard. They just were sitting there in one of the courtyards having a nice barbecue, and they said, let's make this our Shitufei Mavo'ot. And it was good enough. So it doesn't actually have to move. It doesn't have to be transferred. So if that's the case, what was really the problem? The problem is that Rav says this is not a Mavoy. If the doors of the courtyards are open to one another, and each courtyard has its own door open to the Mavoy, okay, then Rav is going to say that's not a Mavoy at all. Because these Chatzerot are actually one big Chatzer. The door goes from one to the other, they're one big Chatzer.
Which Chatzer is one big Chatzer? Like this whole thing is a big Chatzer?
When the doors are open, it's all one big one, because there's a door from one to one to one.
Okay.
So therefore, even though it looks like there are multiple doors, this is really all one thing because you can pass through the entire thing without stopping.
And they're the only ones on the alley.
And they're the only people on that alley. So there's really no mavoy here at all. So how can you permit this courtyard or this mavoy with a lechi v'korah? How are you going to permit this mavoy with a vertical stick or a horizontal stick if we know that really it's only one courtyard open to this mavoy? That's the problem of Rav. So therefore he says, what's the only time that we really are considered to have a mavoy? When these chatzerot are separated completely from one another. But when there's a door opening between each one of the chatzerot, and they're going to combine together. They're going to combine together? So now for sure, that's just now one courtyard. Because you made them into one, and they're even contiguous with one another.
And therefore you don't need a shituf.
So therefore you're not going to need a shituf anyway, because it's not really a mavoy. But you're going to have another problem, which is that you can't rely on lechi v'korah on the end of the mavoy, because that permission was only for a case where multiple courtyards open to that mavoy. So that's why Rav in his version of the Mishnah didn't have the idea that the courtyards were open to one another and made an Eruvei Chatzerot with one another. Because if they make an Eruvei Chatzerot with one another and they're open to one another, that's now all just one courtyard effectively, opening to that mavoy, and the whole halacha of mavoy is not going to apply at all.